Welcome. I'm Emil Møller Hammer.
And I'm Rune Lundahl Hansen.
We both study history at Aarhus University. We have a subject called Learning with Digital Media, in which we are to design a learning experience with the use of digital tools. For our project, we want to look at history in video games, or more precisely, how video games represent history and how we can use video games as a tool for teaching history.
Our goal is to design a session and/or a player experience based on the current climate of historical video games, with the focus on using the medium of video games as a digital tool for teaching history.
But why are video games relevant for us as historians? Video games are a growing industry and are only becoming more and more relevant by the day. In Wainwright's article from the University of Akron, Teaching Historical Theory Through Video Games from 2014, a point is made. As historians, it is imperative that we are prepared to analyze this medium in the same way we view other media. It is important for historians not only to understand video games as a medium, but also know how to utilize it in our works and our studies.
For games, as any other medium, are a source to the past, present and future, and how we work with it as historians is vital for our subject to study relevant historical events about, for example, culture, and how video games have a part in that culture. That is another subject for another day. Before we start talking about learning with video games, how history is represented in them, and our own designs, we find it important to uncover what is a game or a video game. This is to understand the framework of our design. What are our limitations? What do we have to design for it to be classified as a video game in the first place? For example, if we designed a simple historical quiz game, could that be regarded as a video game?
Of course, what a game is could be an entire video by itself, from ancient definitions to all the modern genres of board games, video games, quizzes, sports, etc. But for our definition, we looked upon it from Jesse Schnell's The Book of Lenses, a book about game design. First, he gives a lot of different definitions from different experts and details an explanation of these quotes. He then concludes that a game consists of these elements, and we will use this as a kind of checklist at the end of the video to see if we were able to make a design that includes all these or excludes some of these. More and more studies show that for different reasons our educational systems fail to teach students new information effectively. Actually, the educational systems teach students in some of the least effective ways. As our project explores ways to use video games to enhance learning, understanding how we learn is essential. You see, every brain is unique and uniquely organized, and yet, historically, schools have educated students like they have identical brains. This goes against our beliefs that learning should be individualized and not standardized. This is where video games and gamification of learning can be used as a more efficient tool for learning. Gamification of learning is adding game elements to a classroom to make students perform better and learn what they're supposed to learn.
The main idea is to use games to make learning more exciting. The fact that you learn more when you're entertained is explained by the term episodic learning. A memory is more clear when it's tied to an emotion. That's why games can be good for learning, while regular learning is not. Fun will make learning a more natural experience.
Using game elements to make instructions more meaningful and exciting will harvest the benefits of episodic learning, as meaningful means memorable. And speaking of meaningful, facts in bullet list, the regular learning way, are abstract, while facts in a story, such as in a video game, can give much better context. Making learning fun and exciting will boost students' desire to learn.
After all, most students would probably prefer to play video games than to study the regular way. Would do best to let our passions drive our desires to learn. Also, for the brain to most efficiently process new information, it needs to be in an active state. If the brain encounters new information in a passive state, it has little chance to be encoded into the long-term memory. Video games, though, activate the brain. The captivating power of video games might lie in their interactive nature. Players don't just sit and watch. They get to participate in the action and solve problems. By activating the brain with the activity of playing video games, the students will experience active learning, which is much more memorable. We believe that the same psychological principles that makes games so popular and motivating can work well in designed gamification systems. If we were to create a video games for education, we also create a personal learning environment within the game.
In this personal learning environment, every student has a safe, risk-free learning environment. In a class, you don't want to fail due to a scare that your classmates think you're stupid. In games, you're expected and allowed to fail. It's important because a big part of learning is being allowed to struggle and resolve cognitive conflicts. Learning through video games also helps students who are having trouble paying attention in class. Kids diagnosed with ADHD because they can't pay attention will play games for 9 straight hours on the computer. The game focuses attention in a way that school doesn't. It also helps keeping low-performing students engaged. Many teachers think games can motivate struggling students. Low-performing students are often disengaged from what is happening in the classroom and require the most individualized learning plans. Games are an effective vehicle for addressing these learning gaps. Games not only motivate low-performing students to attend class, but also help them pay attention and make stronger efforts to succeed.
This goes a long way towards educating students in an individualized and not standardized way, as it engages a much larger group of students. Video games can be a resource to provide every student, ADHD or low performing, with an individualized learning plan.
The goal with the game is to provide the player with the combination of tools and services that makes the player learn, while it will be centered around the individual's efforts to learn. If the game was to be a massively multiplayer online game called MMO, we would have created an affinity space. With the proper game design, the game will encourage the sharing of knowledge or participation in a specific area. And that brings us to
In December 2008, a study on the scientific habits of mind in virtual world was released. The idea was that the educational system frames science as a rhetoric of conclusion. It focuses too much on facts instead of the scientific progress. So it doesn't nurture the scientific habit, which is the process of how we reach the conclusions we do, which is a vital part to science.
the article focused on the popular MMO World of Warcraft, where they studied group discussions on the forums before the release of the Burning Crusade expansion in 2006. The claim is that since games are simulated worlds, it has its own physical laws, rules, and systems that you learn. That nurtures the same thing we do when we try to figure out how the real world works.
Why does it benefit the player to learn about all the systems of the world? It's simple, because it lets them progress. The game features things as raids, where a group of players go through hordes of enemies and bosses for loot and prizes. So it is vital to find the most efficient ways to maximize your class's damage, healing, or damage absorption, depending on your role, for a better chance at success.
It is no secret that playing an MMO like World of Warcraft, people learn to work together, and through collaborative problem solving, they start to think systematically. This, the article claims, goes into the scientific habits of mind. For an example, mathematical computation, model-based reason, alternative explanations of data, social knowledge construction, etc., etc.
And these are the results. The most significant habits are social knowledge construction, evaluative, and system-based reasoning. So what we see is players discussing and concluding different subjects within the game to share their findings and discuss them. An example could be, if Mindflay actually got the full scaling of a 3-second cast spell, then by combining Mindflay with both dots and all available talents, to improve those, you would actually see a Shadow Priest scaling maxing out a little under 80% of what a Fire Mage's scaling would max out at 40 fire and nothing more. Here we see an example of a player using his ability to predict and calculate to make a claim that perhaps a Shadow Priest scaling with Mindflay is more efficient than a normal priest. The player discusses in a timely manner and gives statistics to prove it that everyone else can mimic and hopefully get the same results.
And the article concludes that game-related forums like the one examined here are rich sites for social knowledge construction. That game communities engage in productive forms of discussions and problem solving is not surprising. That such an overwhelming majority of their conversations, 86%, is dedicated to such labor is surprising. Of course, this is impressive numbers, But as they mention themselves, this is from the forums and not in the game itself. So it is important to note that yes, MMOs can nurture scientific habits, but this doesn't mean that every player, or even the majority, takes part in these discussions or takes time to learn the most efficient way to utilize their abilities.
Game design, the cornerstone of every video game. Here we have taken a look at A Book of Lenses by Jesse Schell. We are not going through every aspect of game design, then this video would lose focus and be very long, but we will discuss some basics and then go to the things we consider important for our own design ideas.
It is important to know what kind of game mechanics your game consists of, for they create the rules of engagement with the player. Then you might ask, why are things like game mechanics important to a specific historical design? Wainwright, as we mentioned earlier, sums this up. Game mechanics is the least historical theme, but essential to understanding the limitations of video games as presenters of historical content. We have to think about the game mechanics as a means for our design to communicate with the player. For an example, do we want to teach historical method or just simply historical facts? Our mechanics should represent that in ways that make sense, so the player knows what they're supposed to learn from the game.
This brings us over to Jesse Schell, A Book of Lenses, and he explains that good game design happens when you view your game from as many perspectives as possible. I refer to these perspectives as lenses because each one is a way of viewing your design. So when we take our design into consideration, we have to think about as many lenses as possible. An example of one of these lenses could be the lens of emotion. Here we see that lenses are ways of thinking about the design. What kind of emotion do we want? For example, do we want the player to have fun, feel sad, feel invoked, immersed, etc., etc.? These are useful for us to keep track on our own design and help us to think in all these different perspectives to best achieve our goal with our design.
The main idea is to try and design out of these lenses in an attempt to not stray too far into just ideas, because anyone can talk about what they want to have in a game, but to know why it is in there and how it will play out in the broader sense is different. Every idea we present is important to the overall design.
Now, before we start talking about our ideas for design, we want to talk about how history is represented in video games, both in entertainment and more educational. Here we will take examples from games such as Tropico, Total War series, Civilization, and few others. In entertainment, historical video games often use counterfactual events. The focus of these games are not to create an accurate representation, though the more accurate the better, but design after the narrative or / game mechanics.
Take the Total War series for an example. It starts out with fairly accurate historical setting in the beginning of each campaign, but as soon as the campaign begins and the player is in control, it becomes historical fiction based in an historical setting.
Your first priorities as an island nation should be to ensure you have adequate naval defenses in place, as a strong navy is the key to protecting your shores. There's also much unexploited territory in the Indian subcontinent. Gain a foothold here before your rivals do. The once mighty Mughal Empire is on the verge of falling apart.
When looking at an historical design, there are things left out. For this, let's talk about how Empire Total War handled this. Empire takes place in the 18th century during the colonization. For an example, diseases are often accompanied by travel and trade. In Empire, diseases happens randomly. Here, Wainwright makes a good point. The importance of contagious diseases in depopulating the Americas, thus enabling the European settlers and the African slaves that accompanied them to replace much of the indigenous population of the New World. This acknowledgement of the role of diseases replaced an earlier narrative that stressed European superiority to Native Americans in science, technology, and social organization. So when games decide in their design that diseases are random, they effectively raise an entire new problem about how the player might perceive the colonization and how it took place. For an example, that the colonization was made possible only because of science, technology, and social organization.
Another example where we see the idea is to create a better narrative or something that fits within the game mechanics rather than for its historical accuracy is in Civilization 4, where the in-game civic called Free Religion is a civic that fits well with the leader Elizabeth I and As an anonymous writer on the Civilization Wiki observes, free religion is the favorite civic of Elizabeth. Ironically, as historically she had Catholics executed left and right. This is to show that whatever the reason, the developers chose to go for something that fits their mechanics in the broad sense rather than historical accuracy.
All this is important, but when you design something, historical accuracy is not always the main priority. If you create a multiplayer game based on competition, it is vital that both sides' abilities are balanced to an extent that one doesn't easily overpower the other. Taking this into account, you have to know what experience you want to create. Are you simply creating something that takes place in a historical setting, or something that is supposed to be historical accurate? But then, how can games like Total War, Tropico Civilization, these that are mainly created for entertainment, be important to video games as a historical study? Students discuss the possibility of counterfactual scenarios, as well as their own simulations of alternative historical outcomes through gaming. The potential of video games to enable students to explore alternate outcomes sets this medium apart from others, such as film. This is why video games can be very important to history as a subject, but also dangerous. It creates a problem if you say that historical games are accurate information when it's actually counterfactual. Games enable us to talk about history in a different way, but only if we know how the medium works. If we don't know the limits and boundaries, or what things were left out and why the game is built as it is, we can't use it for anything. So the games can allow those interested to dive into history, but also to come out with an inaccurate perception from counterfactual events.
So if we were to utilize video games as a learning tool for kids when it comes to history, we have to build designs through games' strengths and limitations. You have to know what you want to teach. Is it historical method, facts, or theory? Is it entertainment or education? For Kurt Squire writes about this in From Content to Context in 2006. The critical study of games has participation in ideological systems, learning has performance, and educational games has designed experiences. Central to this serious study of games are questions of how players make sense of these digitally mediated experiences. If games are possibility spaces, then researchers need to account for how players inhabit them and the mechanisms by which meanings become interpreted from these experiences. For educators designing games, this shifts for the question from one of delivering content to one of designing experience. This brings us over to how educational games present history in their games. For it is true that you have to design an experience. It's not enough to just deliver loads of historical content and just call it a day. First, we want to look at the Danish quiz game called the Dilemma Game. It isn't a video game per se, but we thought it was important to look at how it wants to convey the occupation of Denmark on April 9th, 1940.
So the game takes the player through a series of questions where they act as the Prime Minister of Denmark and have to make choices on how to act when Germans cross the Danish border. In the end of the game, you'll get results that will show how well you handle it, with what happened and how many died. The purpose of this game is not to communicate what actually happened, but to give context to what did happen. It is for the players to reflect on what choices they made.
This is like the counterfactual settings we see from Total War and Civilization, but just focused into a single event and its outcomes. In the classroom, students can discuss what they did and why they made those choices with a focused quiz. Here, the frame is already set for what players can discuss. So perhaps that is what happens when you create an historical game that aims to teach and entertain. It should be more focused than Civilization and Total War, for those games give too much room for a lot of different discussion topics, so the player has to know what they want to discuss.
The website Meganørd was created by a group of people that originated from history here in Aarhus University, and they have many projects based on historical content. One project we want to talk about is the Shanghai 1927 project. It's an interactive comic book about a 16-year-old girl who gets thrown into the Civil War. The comic book will have lexicons from the 1920s Shanghai and have assignments for elementary school, so the game is made to be something that can teach history as well.
So the games made for education are more limited and focused than its entertainment counterparts, But isn't games supposed to be as interactive as possible? Squire raises a point about the interactivity as a criticism against video games as learning. If a hallmark of games is their interactivity, their ability to grant players agency within the narrative fiction of the game world and its rules, then theoretical models need to account for players' actions in creating the experience. Indeed, because play is instantiated only through players' actions, tensions arise over who exactly is the author of the game experience. He raises a point that if we give the player too many options or too much freedom, can we really design a learning experience after that? Because what stops the player from not just doing what he's supposed to, or just uses his experience in a way that sidetracks from the learning?
For an example, in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, one could easily see themes about being an African American male in the ghetto of Los Angeles and discuss how the game represents that. Or the player can simply not pay attention to the narrative and themes and just go out and cause mayhem.
So perhaps learning experiences should be more limited than an open world sandbox game if the game wants to teach specific subjects, like math or historical events and facts. And more open games can be discussed on a higher level of historical content and not necessarily for the classroom. For there is no doubt that video games can be used as a tool, but it is crucial to know what your purpose with it is.
Example: it's easier to point down in the classroom what historical subject they need to discuss in the dilemma game, the one we talked about earlier, than it is to have everyone play a civilization game because it's so broad. Some might only talk about how the game handles going through the ages and advancing one's civilization. Others might talk about how the game has a very capitalistic view, as its mechanics from the very early age is focused around a market. There are things to discuss, but in a classroom of perhaps 30 people that need to try the game, they won't even be able to finish it, let alone know what they should pay attention to unless told so.
Finally, we got here, where we talk about what we are thinking for a design. Like we mentioned earlier, we will use lenses from a book of lenses, and let's just start with the second lens, the lens of essential experience. And the experience we want players to have is not only to learn about history, but also about historical method. How is it like to work as an historian? For this, we have taken inspiration from a game called Her Story, a murder mystery where the main idea is to watch a bunch of video interviews of this woman. Sounds simple, but the cool part is you don't watch the clips in a specific order. You listen to the first clip and then you will hear something you want to know more about. She might say the word murder and you will search that in the police database and it will show every video she says murder in. So it is about solving a mystery by listening, and whenever she says something that you find suspicious or want to know more about, you search it until you have solved the mystery. And that is not much different from how we work with history. The main difference is, of course, is that the historical sources you have is not designed experiences. So you might find things you want more answers to only to find out that there isn't any other discovered sources on the subject. But the general idea is that you find something that is interesting, search it up, and hopefully find something that mentions whatever you want to know more about. History 101. So how can you mimic this experience in already pre-existing games? Here we want to talk about Tropico 4, a satirical Cold War building simulation game where you play as El Presidente on various different islands, basically Cuba. Not only do you have to build a functioning city, but as El Presidente you can be a dictator that rules with an iron fist or more democratically. And that is not enough. You are constantly balancing between the USSR and the USA and making sure they like you through capitalistic or perhaps more communistic actions, or perhaps just trying to balance between them, not to anger any of them.
Comrade, I have a secret task for you. It is a matter of international urgency.
So the idea is, as of now, you get requests from either side. USA could, for example, tell you, we want you to export a lot of tobacco, but what if, to teach historical method, sometimes you could send out spies, or however you want to represent it, to get secret documents from the USA or USSR about their goals for Tropico, the island you rule. So the player must find what is relevant in the document for them, and not everything could be important to the player, but you have to read it closely to find the information you need. This enables the player to teach themselves about the real contents of Cuba's situation in the 50s through 60s. The only question is then, should these kind of documents be real historical documents or fictional ones? The strength of fictional ones is then you can design your experience as you want and make sure that players learn what they're supposed to learn, because it is designed. Where if it was real documents, the game has to fit around these documents, and that could cause problems in terms of how you want to design the experience, because some of it might contradict. But the strength of real documents are that it teaches actual history, and players will see how actual documents were written in the 60s and also learn how to look at historical sources, for real sources are not designed. A player have to ask the questions themselves, which is a vital part of history as a subject, but it seems like a case to case. It depends on what kind of experience you try and emulate.
An idea for another game design that will increase students' historical knowledge while having fun playing is a quiz-based game. This can be attributed to the lens of problem solving. In this game, the player will guide a specific country through its development in different time periods. Like the game we have already covered, Empire Total War, this game will start out in an accurate historical setting. But unlike most other historical games, this game will not turn to historical fiction. As the player guides the country, he or her will be faced with different problems to test their problem solving. Different situations which actually occurred will rise. Here, the player, based on the state of the country, will have to choose the right direction for the country. If the player makes the wrong choice, feedback will appear that explains the past situation that's being dealt with and why the country decided to go the direction it did, whether if it was a smart move or not. This type of game will present the player not only with cold facts, like in school, but it will provide a lot more context. Animation will visualize the events being covered in the game, keeping the players entertained while playing. Fun and visualizations are great components for long-term memory. The difficulties of the game can be changed by going much more or much less in depth with the events. Also, adding time limitations will keep the players actively engaged. The opportunity to change game difficulties will make sure that the challenges can match the abilities of the players, and thereby create the best learning environment for the players. The game design will include a scoreboard showing how far the player has advanced through a country's real history. The scoreboard will show the players' progress, show where they are heading. This will motivate the players to make progress towards mastering the content. It should send a sign of need for improvement for those who aren't performing well, hopefully increasing their effort. Having this sort of scoreboard can, if played in the classroom and supervised by the teacher, provide the teacher with insight in how the students are doing through the scoreboard. This will, however, shift balance between education and entertainment towards education, reducing the entertainment for the players if they know they're being supervised, thereby removing the safe, risk-free personal learning environment.
So building on the idea of a strategy quiz game and the historical method we talked about, we could mix these together and evolve the lens of curiosity. Like we talked about earlier, that educational games tend to be more focused, so this type of game could be focused around a small series of events that players can interact with, instead of one broad event. One such event could be a murder, for example, and through the over-the-top strategy view, the player makes their decisions. To pique the player's curiosity, we have these perhaps real-life events and or fictional that the players would want to solve, like a murder mystery. And to solve this, different real-life and or fictional documents could be used as clues. An example could be that players find evidence, a knife that killed the victim perhaps, and the game could input an historical document that perhaps was a report that describes the murder. So when the player asks questions like who did it, is there any clues for me, where could I look next, etc., we tie this in with finding evidence in the game, for that would perhaps make them care about what questions a knife at the murder scene could entail.
Which leads us to the next lens, the lens of goals. So this murder case turns into the player's main goal. When the game piqued their curiosity, the goal should be clear for the player: solve the murder in this example. Now, as we talked about before, the designed experience versus historical accuracy, should these documents be real? Well, Since we are not able to actually test the game because we're not making it, we will discuss the pros and cons. It's not without reason that we at the university learn historical method with real sources and not fictional ones. Not only because of its historical accuracy, but because it teaches us that sources don't give us answers to anything unless we ask something about the sources. For an example, imagine that you save all your receipts from the grocery store and someone found some of them 100 years later.
On the outset, receipts don't tell you anything unless you actually ask them something. You might be doing research on general goods stores and buying habits with the consumer, then you find this old receipt, and that can help you with your understanding of consumer habits. But if you didn't ask this, it's just a receipt. On the other hand, this receipt might not give you any of the answers you seek because perhaps you're searching for prices of computer technology in 2017, and this receipt, even though you ask it a question, might not tell you anything you want to know. This is important in historical work, that just because you have an old source doesn't mean anything unless you ask it something.
And this is the opposite if you design fictional historical text in a game, maybe still to teach historical method, but when you read it, you know what the source will tell you. In this case, think of the murder mystery again. You know that the document you have will give you answers to the next clue in some way. Then you could perhaps design it around this and write other fictional documents that doesn't lead anywhere. But if it's fictional, doesn't it kind of lose the point of teaching history? Learning history, at least in this case, should be the motivation. The lens of motivation. The motivation of the player would be to solve the mystery or puzzle or whatever historical challenge the game offers. But behind the scenes, motivation would be for the game to teach history, both factual and method. That is what we want to accomplish. Since we talked about collaborative learning in World of Warcraft earlier, this is where it comes back into play. Well, let's say that this game lets the classroom solve these things together as they progress in the game.
This app on the browser, Hypothesis, lets you annotate and comment on the internet with a group of people. What if we built something similar into the game where other students can annotate the documents to help each other, also so they can discuss together and comment on details they perhaps would think important? Let us say the overarching goal is to defend Denmark from the Prussians in 1864, and students can annotate locations on the map to suggest build your defenses here. So another motivation becomes to solve this together.
So in summary, the game would teach both historical facts and method. The idea is a strategy quiz game that utilizes different historical scenarios that the players need to solve through interacting with the environment and with the aid of historical sources. And keeping the game focused on scenarios rather than just sprawling open gameplay, it helps to build structure in what you're learning as you play. Each scenario would aim to teach something specific in a controlled environment. Also, the game focuses on a collaborative gameplay, so all can help solve the scenarios together. This is to open up for discussions. Games are entered willfully. When a game is used in education, there's always some students that don't want to play, but the general idea is to make it more engaging so more players willfully do engage themselves in learning. Games have goals. Yes, all the different scenarios would have different goals that would work as motivation for the player. Games have conflict. Our ideas for game design do include different conflicts. The game would have rules in how you're able to interact with things and what happens when you interact. Games can be won and lost. The nature of the quiz part makes it so that players would have different scores after each scenario. This is also to create some sort of competition so players would want to improve. Games are interactive. The games are interactive given the interaction with map objects and player characters, and also how the players can collaborate to solve puzzles. Games have challenge, timed challenges or strategic challenges that makes the player focus on the objective. Games can create their own internal value such as scores for how well you did. Games engage players. The games would be designed in an effort to engage players. Games are closed, formal systems. The game would have its own mechanics that would be true for each scenario, so the player doesn't have to learn new system for each new scenario. Games are helping create an educational future where kids are deeply engaged and excited by what they're learning, receive the personal attention and feedback that they need, and are able to develop important skills on their own. Implementing digital games in the classroom has already yielded amazing gains, and we're just beginning to explore their potential. It's time for educators and game developers alike to build a new paradigm for education. That said, it's also important for us to know the limitations of video games as a learning tool and finding a fine line so it doesn't stray too far. Certainly, it is possible to design a game around historical context in ways we haven't seen yet for historical purpose, but we also have to be careful that in a class it doesn't lead to unstructured teaching. Will the teacher be able to keep check on students, and would class lose its pedagogically touch?
Also, would it present a moral issue? If students learn about, let's say, World War II while playing video games and having fun, another thing to keep in mind when promoting video games is the negative effects of gaming. Isabella Granick, PhD of Radboud University, Nijmegen in the Netherlands, says the negative effects of gaming include addiction, depression, and aggression. There are many questions that still need answers when designing educational video games and how important part they should play in education. Also, no doubt that more interactive means of education in general could do wonders for people with ADHD, for example. It's hard to say if we achieved our goal to design something that strikes a balance between fun and educational, for we don't have any means to test it. But without doubt, we think that these ideas are something we or someone else should take into consideration in the future and try out these ideas to create a game that could push the boundaries of entertainment and education.